You know those days where you really want to get out your tarot cards, admire them, and shuffle them, but don't really feel like doing a reading? Sometimes you just want to play, and honestly, that might be the best kind of practice. In this video, I'm sharing some of my favorite ways to connect with my tarot decks without asking questions and doing readings. Practice as play is central in how I work with the cards, and I truly believe that engaging with tarot in as many ways as possible, whether it's organizing, comparing, or curating, can really deepen your practice and enhance your relationship with the cards. If you've ever craved time with your tarot cards but had no questions to ask, then this video is for you. Also, a quick thank you to my lovely Magpie members over on Patreon who chose this video for you today. If you'd like to help shape what I create here and get extra exclusive content, you'll find the link below. Let's get into the video. First up, I want to talk about deck pairs. Playing with pairs and curating little deck selections that will work well together is one of my favorite things to do. I love to do this whenever I get a new deck. If you've watched any of my unboxings, deck walkthroughs, I very often do a little playing with pairs sort of segment in those videos where I see what decks I think would work well with it. I also love creating little mini deck capsule collections. I know I have a few videos here on the channel where I've done that sort of thing, and it is such a fun, tactile way to get into my collection. I love to do a little collage or patchwork style of tarot reading, and so I love to find these little capsules of decks that will work well for that practice. When I do this, the conversations between different decks always help me notice little details in the different representations of cards, like looking at, even if it's not the same card across different decks, but just looking at what different deck creators focus on, what they highlight. It's so interesting to see the decks play off each other and just see what comes up. And I always get some really interesting ideas come up when I put an oracle deck into the mix too. No matter what kind of deck it is, whatever the deck says, it's always so interesting to see whether that fits with the tarot deck that is coming up alongside it or whether it's a contrast. It's just so much fun. And I feel like, along with deck pairings and deck groupings, is mind mapping. And mind mapping is something that I do quite a lot as a note-taking method when I'm doing a reading, but it's also fun just as an addition to this practice to see where those card connections take me with no question in mind and no real desire to find an answer or like a coherent outcome, truly just playing with the cards, seeing what they spark, seeing how the different decks talk to each other, and seeing what comes out of it. Next up, I want to talk about deck baskets, or a little TBR of decks, like a TBR of BookTube, a to be read list. I love to curate. That's one of my big things. I like to group decks according to theme or season. That's very popular here on TarotTube. We all love to do a seasonal deck stack, seasonal deck basket. And this is one of my favorite things to do because, like I say, I love to curate according to a theme. It's a bit of an extension of what I was just talking about with little mini card capsules. But also, this just lets me remind myself what I have in my collection. I do have a larger deck collection. It's more than I can use in any given month, for instance. So I do rotate things in and out, and I like to curate a little deck basket for myself to just remind myself what I've got and to dig back into my collection. So while this is similar to the little deck capsule collections I was mentioning just now, these deck baskets are not necessarily intended to work together like in tandem with each other in a reading. They're just an assortment of decks on a theme. I do these on my channel at the moment for every zodiac sign. I do a little collection of decks to fit that sign. Like I say, we all love to do a seasonal deck basket here on TarotTube, and I do it in my own time, sometimes just based on a theme, based on something I'm thinking about or exploring in my own practice or in my own interests. And often just around a single particular deck, I will be thinking about different facets of that deck's approach that I also then find in other decks and build a little constellation of tarot decks based around that. single deck. As an example, I know I've done a couple of videos of this kind of practice over on Patreon. There was one that was about just the shape that my practice is taking, heavily inspired by the book The Web of Meaning, which I know I've spoken about quite a lot on this channel. It's become something of a Bible, something of a core text for me. And I was talking about different books and decks that all center around those themes of ecosystems, interconnection, and different relationships with nature, and using cards to look at the macro and the micro. Talking about Obsidian, I think, as well, my second brain in Obsidian, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this video too. So it's a collection of decks around a theme, around something that I am thinking about. And I just really enjoy kind of curating a little collection of decks. And like I say, sometimes also books will speak to that central theme that I'm creating a TBR around. Okay, the next way I interact with my decks when I'm not actually doing a reading is quite straightforward, and that is deck mods. Coloring the edges of my decks, edging my decks, trimming them, which I've done for a couple of decks, and rehoming them in a little bag or making a little pouch. I want to take up some crochet again. I made a couple of real wonky deck pouches, and I want to try and refine my technique for some decks that need homes. This is less about spending time with card meanings or specific artwork, but it's still a way of spending time with decks. And maybe I'm personifying my decks a little too heavily here, but when I feel like I've been really neglecting a deck, I've been ignoring it in my collection, it is quite a nice way to sort of spend some time with it, show it some love. Again, I'm not actually using the deck, I'm just edging it or making it a little bag or something, but I feel like I'm showing the deck some love. And this is a way that I think a lot of us probably spend time with our decks when we're not actually doing readings. Okay, next up is deck librarian mode. This is so much fun for me. I love to sort. In case that wasn't already obvious about me as curator of deck collections and deck baskets, and the way I talk about how much I love categorizing things here on this channel, I love to sort. And actually, a project that I really want to tackle is to update my deck spreadsheet. I know that I'm not the only one who has a deck collection and who creates a deck spreadsheet of all the decks that I have, maybe who has published them, whether they're Oracle, Marseille, Rider-Waite-Smith, etc., whether I use them for particular seasonal work. I want to overhaul my deck spreadsheet. It's been a little bit neglected. I'm pretty sure I have added some decks to my collection since I last looked at it. I know for a fact I've removed some decks from my collection since I last looked at it, so I need to offload those into like a RIP moved out of my collection separate spreadsheet. And I really want to include a way to track deck pairings that I like and that I've used, and also deck pairings that I want to try out in a reading, because as much as I love to play with deck pairs and just see what looks good next to each other, like I spoke about at the beginning of this video, that does not necessarily always translate into what works well in a reading. And the inverse of that, sometimes a really unexpected deck pair just works so well at getting messages across, and I find so interesting to actually read with. So that's something that's actually on my little mental list of when I next want to spend some time with my decks that isn't actually reading or really anything to do with reading tarot. So my deck spreadsheet, deck librarian mode, is a big part of my personal tarot adjacent practice. Tarot is a hobby. And in addition to this is, as I mentioned earlier, my Obsidian second brain. Obsidian is a program for note taking, essentially, which functions on linking pages together. So it is fantastic if you either like to think in a way, or you're taking notes on a topic that really relies on interconnections and pulling out those links. That's how my brain works, in case you couldn't tell. And I love Obsidian. I have everything in there. So if I want to do something tarot related, but not necessarily actually do a reading, then I will spend some time in Obsidian and I will work on my personal definitions of cards, I have an entry for each tarot card where I have a little like summary blurb of the card with my favorite keywords and my personal interpretation of that card. And I'll go through and maybe add in some links, or I like to go through my monthly, daily tarot journal and pick out some gems from there, add them to my card interpretations, or even flip through a tarot guidebook that I've highlighted bits of or put loads of sticky notes in and see what I can pull out of that guidebook and add into different card definitions, or honestly just into different notes in my Obsidian, because I have my tarot stuff in there, but then I also have just notes on anything I found vaguely interesting, which I then do like to link to tarot cards. So deck librarian mode, deck academia research study mode is a big favorite thing of mine. And although I'm not necessarily working with specific decks, although like I say, I'll use guidebooks and my notes from specific decks, I am working with the tarot, and personally, study is a huge part of my practice. I am a tarot nerd. That's what I do. So, going through my notes and adding to my notes and sort of deepening my own personal little rabbit hole of research that I've got going on is one of my favorite ways to interact with the system, even if I'm not physically interacting with the cards. Let's talk about the actual cards once again. Another thing that I love to do that isn't actually doing a reading but is playing with my decks is to do some spread crafting, but without actually interpreting the spread. So I'm just playing with layouts, I'm arranging ideas, I'm playing with shapes and concepts, but I'm not actually doing a full reading. I'm just testing out what could become a spread. I get a lot of inspiration from different areas of like science, for instance. I've made spreads from physics equations. I've made spreads based on different processes like the water cycle or the process of pollination of flowers. And so I really like to just play around with those concepts and see what I think would make a functional and interesting tarot spread. I also get a lot of inspiration from astrology. I like making spreads based on different transits. And this is a two for one because astrology is another big interest of mine. So I get to combine my tarot nerdery and my astrology nerdery together in this and try and create spreads to help me understand the transits of the planets to my own birth chart, and that helps me understand the astrology a little bit better. And then trying to figure all of this out for myself within the constraints of what's going to work as a tarot spread, what kind of questions are going to be effective in a tarot spread, what's going to actually work together as an arrangement of cards. It's just fun for me. I really like playing with the system of tarot meanings, as I've spoken about quite a lot, but also just the structure of how tarot works and the ways you can manipulate the process of a tarot reading to get you to interesting places. I just love it. I love to play with a framework and a system and a structure, which is why I love tarot in the first place, and which is why I love making tarot spreads. And just playing around with concepts is truly one of my favorite ways to play with the cards without actually doing a reading. It's close to doing a reading. It's just the ideation process, which honestly sometimes is more fun than actually seeing the thing through, no matter what the thing is. We all love the planning, we all love the ideation process. But I don't always, in this case, actually want to do a reading about it. The tarot spread becomes a playground for exploring ideas, and I really enjoy it. But if I do want a little bit more structure and I do want to think about the actual card meanings, then something else I really love to do is to explore symbols or suits across different decks. So this is great because I get to pull out multiple decks and look at multiple different deck artworks on my desk. For instance, I might lay out all the major arcana from a deck or pull out all of the magician cards specifically from a few different decks, or the swords court, etc., etc., and just compare them, see how different deck creators have emphasized different elements or interpreted different elements differently. As an example, I remember in a tarot lab for the Elements tarot lab that we did, I spent some time comparing the same element in different decks. I remember I was looking at a fiery deck and how a fiery deck and a watery deck each interpreted something like the earth element and how they approached it differently. It was so interesting to see what came up. I took some really interesting notes. And I would thoroughly recommend that kind of practice if you want to interact with the cards, but you don't want to do any like study, you don't want to take some notes, write stuff down, read loads of books, but you also are not feeling like you want to do like a reading and do some interpretation according to specific questions to find specific answers. And this idea of comparing symbols and suits, etc., across different decks is sort of similar to what I was talking about with deck pairings. It's this practice of comparing decks, letting them have a conversation and seeing what that brings up, seeing what that sparks for you intuitively, seeing where different deck creators are kind of at cross purposes, where they are actually talking about different things within these same recognizable archetypes and suits. I do truly believe that creativity requires constraints, or that creativity is about constraints. You're most creative when you have those constraints. And I do find this also applies to interpreting tarot cards. So if you put down the constraint of like, oh, I'm only going to look at cards that are associated with the planet Jupiter, or I'm only going to look at the water suit, or I'm only going to look at the court cards, or whatever the case may be, you get to spot the similarities and differences in approach more clearly necessarily than you would if you were just comparing the decks as a whole, because you're already narrowed in by those constraints. You know that there are similarities between what the cards are trying to represent. You're essentially looking for the differences within the similarities, which sounds complicated, but really what you're looking at is you're looking for the decisions that were made to demonstrate those same ideas, but sometimes with very, very different approaches. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the structure of tarot, the framework of tarot, when I talk about how I truly do think that one needs to engage with the structure of tarot in order to say that you're reading tarot. I've said before, perhaps a little controversially, that if you're just reading intuitively, you're not actually reading tarot. If what you mean when you say that is you're just looking at the cards and seeing what it makes you think of, then you're doing cartomancy. But if you're not engaging with the framework of tarot, the elements, the suits, the symbols, then you're not reading tarot. And I think there is so much richness to be found in engaging with that structure, which is what I've just been talking about. I think it is endlessly fascinating. It is one of the reasons that I love tarot. So really, that's what all of these practices have in common. They're ways of playing and exploring with your cards and spending time with your cards and personalizing your understanding of what the tarot is and what the different cards mean and how you interact with them, playing and letting the connections unfold. So that is everything from me today. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know how you like to play with the cards that isn't just reading, because I know I'm not the only one who wants to play with my tarot decks. I just sometimes do not have the mental capacity to do a full tarot reading. So I would love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments. Do come and join us over on Patreon if you like this kind of approach to tarot. It is what I do over there in the Tarot Lab. We would love to have you. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Give this video a like if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, all that good stuff. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.